You are listening to rudolfsteineraudio.com. As well, you can hear these podcasts at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. There are two publishing houses, steinerbooks.org in America and rudolfsteinerpress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works Volume 62 by Rudolf Steiner, 14 lectures entitled Results of Spiritual Research, translated by Simon Blaxland DeLange. This is Lecture 8, given in Berlin on the 16th of January, 1913, entitled The World Conception of a Cultural Researcher of the Present, Hermann Grimm, and Spiritual Research. It might easily seem as if what is represented here as spiritual research is quite isolated from present-day cultural life and has no connection with what otherwise occupies a dominant position in the intellectual life of modern times and in a certain sense sets the tone for it. However, this can appear to be so only to someone who understands this spiritual science or spiritual research in a limited, narrow-minded way and sees in it nothing more than a collection of teachings and theories. But someone who sees in it a spiritual stream that wants to receive into itself everything toward which the various trends in cultural life are leading it, will become aware that from this spiritual stream, the seeds for the future development of many aspects of modern cultural life can be derived. And that this way of contemplating life known as spiritual science can be applied to other schools of thought that have a greater or lesser affinity to it. I shall speak today about one such school of thought, which can be represented by a very notable figure in modern cultural life, namely the modern cultural researcher and art historian Hermann Grimm. Hermann Grimm, who was born in 1828 and died in 1901, indeed appears on the one hand as a quite especially characteristic example of modern cultural life, while nevertheless being so individually distinctive, so particular a figure, that it is especially good to link today's studies with this personality. Hermann Grimm appears to someone who has concerned himself with him as a kind of intermediary between that cultural life of more recent times, which is associated with the name of Goethe, and our own modern cultural life. Hermann Grimm is connected in a quite particular way with everything that can be linked with the name of Goethe through his marriage with that personality who was so closely related to the circle around Goethe, the sister of the romantic poet Brentano. Thus Hermann Grimm was related, as a son-in-law, to that Bettina Brentano, who had published the remarkable correspondence of Goethe with a child, that Bettina Brentano from whom derives that unique memorial of Goethe, where we see him sitting enthroned like an Olympiad, a musical instrument in his hand, enmeshing a child in the strings in whom Bettina Brentano portrayed herself. It was as a child that this personality, deriving from the Frankfurt circle of La Rocha, appeared in her relationship to Goethe, and she was able to become absorbed in Goethe's spirit, as was possible for only few people. And even if so many people find inexactitudes in the letters that Bettina Brentano made known, together with a colorful mixture of truth and fiction, one must nevertheless say that everything that we have in this remarkable book, titled Goethe's Briefwechsel mit einem Kinde, has genuinely arisen from Goethe's cast of mind, and gives us in a quite wonderful way an echo of it. Bettina Brentano's second marriage was with the poet Achim von Arnim, who was involved with the beautiful collection of folk literature titled Des Knaben Wunderhorn. Through his relationship with this circle, as said, Hermann Grimm's wife, Gisela Grimm, was a daughter of Bettina Brentano, or Bettina von Arnim. Hermann Grimm had from a young age grown up amidst personalities who were really close to Goethe, and who in all that he received in his education passed on to him something like a personal and directly elemental breath of Goethe's spirit. Thus Hermann Grimm also felt from his early days that he belonged with all those who still stood close to Goethe, in spite of the fact that he was still a child when Goethe died. And Hermann Grimm was not like someone who has studied Goethe and Goetheanism, but he had received Goethe's being, the whole vitality of his magical power, and the entirety of his living human nature directly, elementally, and personally into his own being. Thus Hermann Grimm had an intimate part in the evolution of German life in the middle decades of the 19th century. He participated in it in such a way that he, as it were, established his own realm within this German life. One can call him a spirit who, in the most individual way, always directed his energies toward what he found stimulating, what was fruitful for the development of his own spiritual forces. By this means, Hermann Grimm carved out for himself from the full extent of cultural life what was suitable for him, a cultural sphere in which he felt at home. Within this cultural sphere in which he felt at home, Hermann Grimm recognized himself to be a kind of spiritual representative of Goethe. To him, Goethe's spirit appeared as a being with a continuing existence. And where he sought the streams of what in cultural life conformed to his own inclinations and allowed them to work upon him, this was always more or less the essence of Goethe's nature, which he not only sought to become aware of, but became the measure of everything that he encountered in his intellectual and cultural endeavors. The years that Hermann Grimm lived through were decades that witnessed a struggle in German cultural life. These were decades when, after Goethe's death, the essence of his spirit withdrew to some extent, when people had to attend to many other things, which one might say more concerned daily affairs than the influences that proceeded from Goethe. In that time when many other things had become somewhat quiet, Hermann Grimm probably saw himself, through his direct connection with the being of Goethe, as a person whose task it was, quietly, but also livingly, to cultivate the essence of Goethe's nature, and to carry it over to a time that he surely hoped would come, a time when Goethe's star might once more shed its light more livingly in the European cultural firmament. Thus, the way that Hermann Grimm regarded himself as a kind of spiritual representative of Goethe, of his spiritual sphere, was somewhat characteristic of how he quite naturally dealt with cultural life, of how he related to intellectual affairs. It belonged to him as it would to an intellectual prince. Even in his outward form and physiognomy, his gestures and his whole appearance, he had something of the quality of an intellectual prince. And one can say that even if one was, so to speak, unaccustomed to regard someone as having princely qualities, Hermann Grimm's whole manner compelled one to attribute to him the rank that has been characterized. Thus I still fondly recall meeting with Hermann Grimm in Weimar, where he so often and so gladly came. He had invited me as his only guest to a midday meal. We spoke about many things that affected him. We also spoke, and it was a fulfilling experience for me, that he wanted to have this conversation with me, about his extensive plans as regards his intellectual life. And when a certain time after lunch had passed, he said, with his distinctive humor, but nevertheless in a wholly natural way, so that one could receive it from him as something purely as a matter of course, quote, "Now, my dear doctor, I want to dismiss you in good favor," close quote. It was indeed something that at the time made upon me an impression of being the most natural thing in the world to say, because Hermann Grimm's appearance was of such a kind that one attributed to him a certain princely quality. The whole of Hermann Grimm's life's work bears something of this character. One cannot attentively read any of his larger or smaller writings without having the feeling that amidst the wonderfully harmonious and yet so precisely constructed sentences that envelop one's soul, the personality of the author is constantly present behind them, looking at one, and with an immensely personal interest, is directly imparting to one what he has to say. This is responsible for the wonderful soul quality that sounds through Hermann Grimm's writings, so that they are, in this most beautiful way, invariably the expression of his soul-filled personality, and also directly work in this way. Because of this, his whole style acquires the character of a certain justified, noble pathos. But this noble pathos is everywhere moderated by the personal element that one feels breaking forth from it. One accepts this style, in spite of its elevated quality, as something quite natural, and one constantly feels that the Goethean element is pervaded by the romantic nature of German cultural development. A certain sense of separation from everything that one can, in the broadest sense, call the everyday, the popular, a withdrawal into a single personality, a wholly individual being, a wholly individual manner of approach. This is what we sense in the style of Hermann Grimm. This tendency in Hermann Grimm's spirit might perhaps have led to a certain one-sidedness if another stream had not worked within him in combination, which connected him so fervently with everything of a popular nature and rooted him deeply in the spirit of popular culture. For Hermann Grimm was himself the son of Wilhelm Grimm and the nephew of Jakob Grimm. These are the two men who established German linguistic research in the 19th century, the men who collected those German fairy tales that have meanwhile become so deeply a part of German cultural life. Those men who listened to what simple folk from the people related through legends and fairy tales. Legends and fairy tales that had lived for hundreds of years in the minds of the simplest people and were almost forgotten before they were conveyed by a few individuals to modern times, when they were enabled to live again today through the agency of the brothers Grimm. If therefore Hermann Grimm, despite the elevated style of everything he wrote, shows something of an affinity with everything of a popular nature, we must emphasize something further that harmoniously connects an intellectual tendency that might otherwise have developed in a one-sided way with another stream, so that everything in him appears to us as a kind of inner harmonious totality. If we allow Hermann Grimm to make an impression on us, we do, after all, find a certain softness, a kind of eager receptiveness to all the cultural phenomena with which he was involved in the course of his life. A person needs a degree of isolation if he wants to immerse himself in the facts and phenomena of many centuries of intellectual history. But this softness, additionally, acquires its skeletal aspect, its hardness in Hermann Grimm, through something else that flowed into his upbringing. His father and his uncle belonged to those Göttinger Sieben, who in 1837 lodged a protest against the abolition of the constitution of their state and were therefore dismissed from Göttingen University. Thus already as a boy, Hermann Grimm experienced a deed of a rare nature, and experienced this deed with manifold consequences. For there were numerous consequences for both father and uncle that extended to their daily lives, in that they had lost not only their positions at that time, but also bare essentials. And Hermann Grimm frequently emphasized how he formed a connection with the impulses of history already as a 9-year-old boy, not through the book, but through a significant historical deed. Thus Hermann Grimm stands before us as a personality. He came to prominence as a kind of bearer of Goethe's spirit at the time when matters relating to Goethe in Germany had entered into a period of relative quietness, and people had turned toward other things. But he experienced that this interest in Goethe was again restored, and that he himself could contribute much to the re-enlivening of this mood. At the beginning of the 1870s, he was able to give his famous lectures on Goethe at Berlin University, those lectures on Goethe that feature in his important book about him. And what a book this is! Anyone who acquires it as a young person and is able to relate to it in the right way can without doubt speak of it in later life as something significant. And just as it comes to expression in this book, so does Hermann Grimm appear before us as one who has the capacity to relate to Goethe, as one who has entered fully into the various aspects of his soul life. Thus he explores Goethe's works in succession, examining what passed through Goethe's own soul when he was engaged in the creation of these works. So we can listen to the way that Hermann Grimm considered such a personality as Goethe as he saw him. We find nothing resembling a search for pernickety biographical details or a pursuit of essentially insignificant aspects of his life. There is instead an immersion in everything in Goethe's life that was of significance and importance for his soul development. The endeavor to trace the effect of what Goethe experienced, what was working and living in his soul, how it was transformed so that it acquired certain forms, so that it became a picture, a creation of his imagination. For Goethe himself, forgetting everything about the original life experience, reached up to that new insight that had emerged from the experience in the creativity of imagination, which now is itself an experience. Thus, with every consideration of a work by Goethe, through Hermann Grimm's study of him, Goethe rises a stage higher in his experiences. He rises directly into a sphere of pure spiritual perception. Through each one of Goethe's works, Hermann Grimm shows how Goethe ascended from his life to spiritual experience and spiritual existence. And we are always glad to accompany him on this path that he follows, because nowhere in Hermann Grimm does something happen that can so easily occur with such a presentation. That a single soul faculty, the intellect or the imagination, accompanies the observer, and one no longer feels oneself to be in contact with the life itself. No, Hermann Grimm never goes further than, but always as far as, he as a personal individuality can himself go. And he is therefore able to encompass the whole work. Overall, one feels that when Hermann Grimm has led one to the point where the work in question had its origin in Goethe's experience, one has been transported to a purely spiritual life. Goethe becomes for one a being whose inner nature is purely spiritual, a sum of purely spiritual impulses. This breath of the world of spirit extends throughout everything that Hermann Grimm presents in his book on Goethe. What Hermann Grimm directed toward Goethe became deeply rooted in his whole mental outlook. Probably a long time prior to this, when he embarked upon the studies that culminated in his lectures on Goethe, he conceived of a great idea of vast proportions, that of studying the cultural life of the West as a whole in the way that he came to study it on an individual basis with respect to Goethe. The idea came to him of tracing 3,000 years of Western cultural life, such that it everywhere becomes apparent how everyday events and facts existing in the physical world acquire their true worth by being transformed through human minds and sensibilities into what the human soul experiences when it ascends to the realm of what Hermann Grimm called the creative imagination. Thus, Hermann Grimm became an historical observer of a quite distinctive kind. For him, history was something entirely different than it was for all other observers of history. History is usually studied in such a way that one assembles documents and other materials, and then tries to present a picture of human evolution out of these materials. For Hermann Grimm, materials of this kind, outward facts, were indeed highly important, but not the main thing. He frequently had the thought running through his mind, could it not be that for a particular period of time, precisely the most important documents, those that are decisive if one wants to study the impulses of the age, have disappeared without a trace and have been lost, so that if one considers documents to give the most exact, the most faithful picture, one will, for the most part, miss the truth? He was therefore convinced that someone who has the greatest faith in outward documents is least able to give a true picture of human evolution. In Hermann Grimm's view, only a false picture of human evolution could emerge if one relies on outward documents. But there is another whole facet of the cultural life of mankind. What has occurred outwardly, what has taken place in the form of outward facts, has come to a spiritual rebirth, in particular individuals. It has found expression in those personalities who have transformed it artistically, who have given it cultural and spiritual worth. Thus, for example, Hermann Grimm looked at the time of ancient Greece. He said to himself, a number of documents exist about this Greek period. From these documents, the understanding that can be gained for the world of ancient Greece will be lacking in authenticity. But what the Greeks have experienced has been reborn in the works of Greek art. It has come to life again in particular Greek individuals. If one devotes one's attention to them, one opens oneself up to the influence of the world of ancient Greece through the medium of the personality. And one will have a more faithful picture of this world than if one merely combines facts in an outward way. And so these facts, in a sense, disappeared for Hermann Grimm. One might say that they evaporated from his world picture. And what remained in his world picture was a continuing stream of what he called the creations of popular imagination. If, for example, he wanted to study Julius Caesar, he not only concerned himself with the historical documents, but he believed that what Shakespeare made of Caesar had just as much significance for Caesar as what can be found in the historical documents. He viewed the times through human beings. Not only that the course of human evolution became to him something that one personality always passed on to another, but the whole course of human evolution itself became to him a spiritual process, which he believed he had thoroughly dealt with in what he called the creative imagination. He wanted from this standpoint increasingly to acquire for himself a picture of the popular imagination creative in the Western cultures. He wanted to form a connection with the course of human evolution in the West, such that he could say to himself, as the various streams of the Western cultures merge with one another, as they become detached from the oldest times to which he wanted to go back, and extend to his own Goethean age, so do they appear as an ongoing stream of the weaving of popular imagination among the Western peoples. On the strength of this impulse, the focus of his attention was at an early stage directed toward that magnificent manifestation of Western cultural life which concerned him for a while, and regarding which he wrote in the 1890s, a book unparalleled in its beauty, his Homer, his description of the Iliad. This book, which is always good to have around if one wants to study the early period of ancient Greece from a modern spiritual standpoint, again shows us Hermann Grimm, if we presuppose his general intellectual approach, from a quite particular aspect. His attention encompasses the gods and the world of the gods portrayed in Homer's Iliad. It takes in the battling Greek and Trojan heroes, and the question arises before his soul, how is it then, with this interaction of a world of the gods, with the ordinary human world of battling Greeks and Trojans? This becomes a question for him. He is struck by the immense difference that exists in Homer's descriptions between a humanity that roams the earth and those beings who are portrayed as immortal gods. And Hermann Grimm now tries to present the idea that the gods, as Homer portrays them, represent an older layer of beings inhabiting the earth. Even though Hermann Grimm, in his more realistic way, sees these beings as, in quotes, human beings, he is, nevertheless, looking back to a culture which has become detached from another culture to which the Trojan and Greek heroes belong. Hermann Grimm discerns an older and a younger layer of humanity interacting in Homer's Iliad. And what remains of the living influences from a previously living layer of beings plays for Hermann Grimm into Homer's portrayal of what is enacted between Greece and Troy. In this way, Hermann Grimm altogether sees in the progress of human evolution a constant process of detachment of older, what we might call circles or cycles of culture, from newer ones. and an interplay of the old into the new. Every new cultural cycle has a certain task, the task of bringing something new into the general evolution of mankind. The old continues in existence for a while, exerting its influence upon the new. One could say that Hermann Grimm's insight into what must also be presented today from the standpoint of modern spiritual science extended as far as was possible for anyone in the last third of the 19th century. He did not go back beyond the age of ancient Greece. He was therefore unable to give what more recent spiritual research describes in reaching back to purely spiritual beings, higher than human beings, who existed before humanity. But he touched everywhere upon these results of more recent spiritual research, and as closely as anyone who has not himself come to embrace spiritual research can do so. In spiritual research, we try to represent the idea that when we go back in human evolution, we do not come to the animal kingdom, as the Darwinist theory, which is interpreted materialistically today, would have it, but that we come back to purely spiritual ancestors of human beings, and that behind that cycle of humanity where human souls live incarnated in the physical body, we have another cycle of humanity in which human beings are not yet incarnated in the physical body. Hermann Grimm, as it were, leaves unresolved the question as to the nature of the gods, in quotes, before human beings came to tread the earth. But he recognizes the lawful succession of such cycles of humanity. This gives a significant point of contact with the descriptions of spiritual research, that he altogether recognizes such regular advances occurring over periods brings him, so to speak, especially close to us. He sought to extend his cultural researches over 3 millennia. The first millennium for him is that of Greece. One could say that it sounds something like an undertone through Hermann Grimm's research, if one hears from him how he characterizes these Greeks in this way, when he says, yes, if one looks upon the Greeks, they appear to one, especially in the earliest period, as not so formed as present-day human beings. Even a person like Alcibiades still appears to one as a kind of fairy tale prince. One is beholding something of a superhuman nature. And yet from this spiritual world of the Greeks, whom Hermann Grimm, as we have said, portrays as dissimilar to the later human world, everything that gave rise to impulses in the world of the Greeks also projects into the later world, so that it forms the most important element within our cultural life, even to our modern times. And at the end of the first millennium that Hermann Grimm considers, there comes before his soul the most important impulse that he recognizes in the evolution of mankind, the Christ impulse. When Hermann Grimm speaks about the figure of Christ, he is in a certain sense reserved, as he is altogether reserved about many things. But the observations that he generally makes about Christ show us that he would just as little agree with those who, so to speak, would like to make Christ evaporate in a cloud of thoughts, as with those who want to see in the personality of Christ Jesus only something of a generally human nature. He emphasizes that a twofold impulse proceeds from the figure of Christ, an impulse of colossal strength, which then also for Hermann Grimm continues to work through the whole of the rest of human evolution, and the other impulse of an immense gentleness. Hermann Grimm finds that the whole second millennium of Western cultural development is shaped in such a way that the world of ancient Greece is as though absorbed by the Christ impulse, and with this combination of Christianity and Greek thought, now enters into the human world, overpowers it, and brings forth something quite special. This is his second millennium, the first Christian millennium. The impulses of Rome are not of primary importance for him, whereas those of Christianity are. Everything political, everything outwardly matter-of-fact, disappears for Hermann Grimm's perception, and he everywhere examines how the Christ impulse makes its presence felt, and how diversified is its form. Thus his conception of Christ is not narrow, not small, but wide. When the book about the title Life of Jesus by Ernest Renan appeared, Hermann Grimm followed this up with a remarkable study in the journal that he published at that time titled Künstler und Kunstwerk, Artists and Works of Art. He tried to show how pictorial representations of the figure of Christ have changed over the centuries, both in painting and sculpture and also in literature. Thus he tried to show the variability, the changeability of the Christ impulse. And he showed how people have always conceived of the Christ impulse in accordance with the way they thought about things. And he then sees in Ernest Renan someone who in the 19th century endeavored to conceive of Christ from a certain narrow point of view. Christianity, thinks Hermann Grimm, needed 1,000 years in order to transmit its impulses to the rivulets and streams of Western cultural life. Then came his third millennium, the second Christian millennium, in which we now still are. That millennium at the beginning of which spirits such as Dante and Giotto were active, and artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and so on, and which led then to the spiritual achievements of Shakespeare and Goethe. These cycles in the evolution of humanity were, for Hermann Grimm, always defined wholly in accordance with spiritual laws. He perceived spiritual laws governing human evolution, whose onflowing stream he identified in the nature of creative imagination. In his lectures, Hermann Grimm ever and again sought to place the organizational principle of the stream of human evolution before his students, in order to be able to show how individual spiritual creativity has its place in the totality of the stream. Thus Michelangelo, Raphael, Savonarola, Shakespeare, and others, also Goethe, were to him a spiritual content that can be explained if one sees it against the background of that onflowing stream of creative imagination, which for Hermann Grimm became especially discernible in its source in Homer in the 9th or more likely the 10th century before the Christian era. For this reason, Hermann Grimm addresses one on such an unfathomable level, because he often, when he evokes in one an interest in a work of art, for example, Raphael's title Marriage of Mary and Joseph, one of the Madonna pictures or other works, one of Leonardo da Vinci's pictures, or when he points out something that he has observed in Goethe, gives one the feeling that one is experiencing what is most directly individual about this work of art. If one now observes with him how the particular color or gesture has been depicted in the work of art, and in this way believes oneself to be standing in isolation before the work of art, something like a tableau of the whole progress of humanity suddenly appears, a part of that ongoing stream of creative imagination that extends over 3 millennia and includes within itself all the various individual elements. Thus one is led by Hermann Grimm into the intimate individual nature of the works of art concerned, and then to the summit from where the whole stream can be observed. However, this was not something that Hermann Grimm viewed in a theoretical way. It seemed to be something so natural for him to behold in this way the totality of the onflowing spiritual stream of human evolution, as he explained to me, as I said, at the time when we shared a midday meal, because he really lived with his whole soul in this spiritual stream, and he could by no means perceive a single phenomenon other than as a fragment of this mighty stream of the evolution of mankind. That the whole of Western cultural evolution is a development of popular imagination was to him no general abstract idea, but was full of the most tangible content. He knew himself to be so connected with his soul, with this content that radiates through millennia, that everything that he wrote actually appears to one as the separate little sections and extracts of a work of vast proportions. Even if one reads no more than a review of one of his books, one has the impression that it has been extracted from a colossal work which presents the whole of human evolution as an imaginative creation. One feels oneself to be placed before a work of vast proportions, as if one had embarked on it and was reading just the first few lines of it, when one reads an article or essay or anything from a book by Hermann Grimm. And one now understands how Hermann Grimm himself could say, when, toward the end of his life, he wrote the preface to his collection of fragments, that to him it appeared that they contained a description of the whole of Western culture. One understands that the individual work that he has undertaken seemed to be one of several individual parts that he had taken from a finished work. Thus he never attributed more value to what he had published than to what he had written, and never more value to what he had written than to everything that lived in his thoughts. When one indicates something of this kind, one would, without involving abstract formulations, want to have said something about that feeling that, as someone who has been and still is fond of Hermann Grimm, one has about the fact that he was never able to arrive at the point of really carrying out what so beautifully, so hugely, and so magnificently stood before his spirit, that even his writings on Homer, on Raphael, Michelangelo, and on Goethe appeared to us as fragments from this unwritten, all-encompassing work. It is with a certain melancholy feeling that one can read those lines of the introduction already mentioned to his title, Fragments, where he states that he was constantly revising what he had to say to his students year after year about the evolution of European cultural life, and that it might perhaps be permissible to turn the last form that these lectures had received into a book which would, in a certain sense, represent the progress of European cultural development. But that, unfortunately, there would probably not be another of these revisions. One reads these lines today all the more wistfully, since this revision indeed did not come about. And we have to see Hermann Grimm dying in the knowledge of what lived in his soul, and have had to see that what lived in his soul for the culture of the present had to go with him to the grave. This gives us some idea of the viewpoint from which everything of Hermann Grimm's was written. If spiritual research wants to be that which can be attained through the expanding of one's range of vision, one must say that anyone who truly enters into Hermann Grimm's mind and manner of expression has the most perfect guidance from modern cultural life for gradually entering into the whole mode of perception that belongs to spiritual research. But even if the breadth of Hermann Grimm's range of vision is disregarded, and one seeks to gain insight into his soul, into how he sought to approach phenomena, how his feelings and thoughts led him to everything that he has written in his extensive studies of Homer, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Goethe, and if one takes into consideration what he has presented in his other writings, one finds that he can, to a significant degree, be distinguished from other spirits, and that he has something that belongs to that deepening of the soul that was spoken of here when the path was described that the soul has to take in order to enter the spiritual worlds themselves. We have already emphasized that the intensity of the soul forces must become stronger for the spiritual path, that if deeper soul forces are to be drawn forth which otherwise slumber, the soul must employ more inner strength, more inner courage and boldness, must identify itself more with its own being, with the forces of thinking, feeling, and will. Hermann Grimm wrote a constant flow of essays to this end. Essays that, it is true, took a different course, essays through which he became able to describe works of art in so intimate and personal a way, as he described those of Raphael or Michelangelo, but was on the way to gaining deeper insight into the spiritual world. For it is not that which one calls objective today that lies at the foundation of Hermann Grimm's historical research, but rather an affinity with the phenomena of the cultural life that he is depicting. Thus he immerses himself in the respective cultural themes in complete self-forgetfulness, and yet in a strange way possessed of self-consciousness. This is especially apparent when he first leads his own soul to focus on a particular cultural figure, for example on Raphael, and then raises this single cultural phenomenon to the collective stream of human cultural life. His feelings then become bold, mighty ideas, and what many others did not dare to express in such nuances of feeling and in such nuances of ideas is achieved by Hermann Grimm, who thereby becomes an interpreter of the Spirit, who so impresses us with the boldness of his interpretations that we are sometimes truly reminded of those who wrote the Gospels. It is only that they wrote with more of a mystic quality, and Hermann Grimm with more modern spiritual observation. And just as they reach up to the horizon of the whole of humanity, so does Hermann Grimm with his Raphael reach up to the horizon of humanity as a whole. It is wonderful when, in his bold way, as though his soul is being drawn out of itself and is striding along beside Raphael as in a stream of general development, he breaks out in words that can express more to us than a mere description of world history. Quote, Raphael is a citizen of world history. He is like someone from the four rivers that, as the ancient world believed, came from paradise. Close quote. When one dwells upon such phrases as this, one indeed knows something quite different about the relationship of Hermann Grimm to Raphael than one otherwise knows about the relationship of many other interpreters to particular phenomena. Thus, for Hermann Grimm, personalities flow together with the total stream of cultural life. One could also say that he brings the highest spiritual sphere down to the most personal element, and a wealth of spiritual experiences come toward us when Hermann Grimm speaks the following words from the depths of his soul, as he gives expression to how he relates to the cultural realities with which he is concerned. Quote, were Michelangelo called forth by a miracle from the dead in order to live among us again, and were I to meet him, I would reverently stand aside so that he might pass. But if I were to encounter Raphael, I would go behind him to see whether I might find an opportunity to hear a few words from his lips. With Leonardo and Michelangelo, one can confine oneself to relating what they were to their times. With Raphael, one must speak about what he is to us today. Over those others a gentle veil has been laid, but not over Raphael. He is one of those whose growth is not yet at an end by a long way. There will always be future races of people to whom Raphael will pose new riddles. Close quote, Steiner again. This is a characteristic mood, not objective in the sense that one so often demands today, but describing the corresponding phenomena in such a way that we feel directly drawn into their proximity when we are able to feel a breath of what was living in Hermann Grimm's soul when he could write such sentences. Then one also understands how this spirit was able to struggle with the phenomenon of world history, and specifically with Raphael. It is remarkable, as he himself asserts, how he related to Raphael, quite differently to how, for example, he expressed himself when he wanted to give a description of Michelangelo. The portrayal of Michelangelo's life by Hermann Grimm is a wonderful book, in spite of the fact that in many ways it can perhaps be regarded as superseded today. How significant the figure of Michelangelo appears in the context of the whole life of the Middle Ages, how it stands out from the other figures who feature prominently, how it stands out from the wholly unique description of Florence itself, or how it stands out from that tableau that Hermann Grimm presents by letting two spiritual forms rise up before our mind, Athens and Florence, thus enabling the interweaving of the 3 millennia that he has characterized to appear as a mighty background against which figures such as Dante, Giotto, and the other painters of that time stand out.